The Syrian opposition conference starts in Cairo today with 250 members from the Syrian opposition. Morsi declares his support for the Syrian revolution. Zibari announces his support is biased, and Uglo declares that his country is a haven for refugees.
The process for political change in Syria is now shared unequivocally by the entire international community.
And at least 80 killed in Syria today, and the Syrian citizens continue to protest against the regime amid an increase in military campaigns. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. A meeting for the Syrian opposition groups kicked off in Cairo today to discuss an international plan for a transitional Syrian government. The meeting, which started with a minute of silence to mourn all those killed in Syria brutally, will be followed by talks on Tuesday with Arab ministers in a bid to agree on a shared platform.
كل الفرقاء من الشعب السوري أو الفاعلين الدوليين من خلال الجامعة العربية.
More than 250 different Syrian opposition members met today in Cairo under one umbrella, a meeting that is considered one of its kind since the start of the revolution against the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. The overthrow of al-Assad's regime is the first consensus of the participants in the conference, and a prerequisite to the start of a dialogue about the future of Syria, which the Contact Group on Syria failed to achieve in the conference in Geneva last Saturday. And observers say that this conference might be a turning point in the history of the Syrian revolution because it contains the diverse groups of the Syrian opposition, which agreed to issue two important documents that may form the new features of Syria after al-Assad's regime. The outcome of the conference will result in a common vision that structures post-Assad era, and many participants think that this is the strongest way to pressure the international community to intervene directly in order to stop the massacres committed by the regime in Syria. And in spite of the importance of this conference, which is the first meeting of the Syrian opposition, the rebels continue to control the situation on the ground, facing the regime's killing machine to achieve their freedom.
The Arab League Secretary General Nabil al-Arabi spoke to at least 250 members of the Syrian opposition at the Cairo meeting, trying to persuade them to unite, saying that they must not waste this international effort, stressing that if they don't unite and overlook their factional disagreements, the Syrian people's future and safety would be at stake. The UN and the Arab League envoy Annan's top deputy, Nasser al-Qudwa, addressed the Syrian opposition, saying they must formulate a unified set of demands that would create better cooperation with the international community in finding a solution for the crisis in Syria. The Iraqi Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zibari, whose country currently holds the Arab Summit presidency, stressed that the handover should be placed without foreign intervention or further bloodshed. He also called for a peaceful transition of power that will also fulfill the aspirations of the Syrian people towards democracy and to determine their own destiny. Zibari spoke as a foreign minister of Iraq and not as the head of the Arab Summit, stressing that the position of Iraq was not neutral, but was with the aspirations of the Syrian people, especially that the Syrian system had negative attitudes towards the emerging political process in Iraq, adding that his country will make every effort until a peaceful transition democracy in Syria is received by the Syrian representatives who are facing the Syrian people. The foreign ministers of Egypt, Kuwait and Qatar hope that the meeting would come out with a clear vision, as the Egyptian foreign minister confirmed that agreeing on the Free Syrian principle will comfort the Syrian society. And he added that an investigation should take place soon to hold those who perpetrated the crimes accountable. While the Qatari Minister of State for Foreign Affairs said that he stressed actually the opposition groups must overcome their differences and band together to agree on a roadmap that draws a better future for Syria. In the meantime, the coordinator of the preparatory meeting or the committee of the Syrian Opposition Conference, Rima Falhan, said no transition would be possible without al-Assad power. Coming up later in the bulletin, clashes in Aleppo suburbs and citizens continue calling for freedom. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. Dr. Walid Al-Bunni, who took part in the conference, also confirmed in an interview with our reporter in Cairo that the Syrian opposition is unified on the position that no negotiations will be made until after the departure of al-Assad and the termination of his regime. Also that the preparatory committee for the conference recommended that the authority follows up with the conference representatives of all the opposition parties. The Turkish Foreign Minister Dawood Uglo stressed in his speech in front of the conference that the Syrian people and the opposition forces have to speak in one voice for the future of Syria.
The only interlocutor for Turkey in Syria is now the Syrian people and their representatives, that is the Syrian opposition, which means you, and nobody else. We have always believed that the future of Syria belongs to the Syrian people and that it will be shaped by the Syrian people. We have never thought otherwise. We have supported and worked towards the unification of the people around a common vision for Syria so that they could be the owners of their own future.
He also stressed that the regime lost its legitimacy inside Syria, so it cannot gain international legitimacy, and Turkey still keeps its doors open for all Syrians.
We have kept our doors wide open to Syrian refugees. All of them are brothers and sisters, and as I have repeated several times, our homes, our cities, our towns, our hearts are open for all Syrians, brothers and sisters who are escaping from Syrian regime.
In an interview with Orient News, Wahid Saqr, a member of the Syrian National Council, confirmed that the objective of the Syrian Opposition Conference in Cairo today is much higher than that of the Geneva Conference. He also expressed his optimistic vision of true central unity amongst the Syrian society, regardless of any sectarian differences, with us on the line right now. And with us on the line right now is Dr. Radwan Ziad, Director of the National Council, Syrian Foreign Relations, who is currently in Cairo. Dr. Radwan, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Radwan, what is your take on the decisions and speeches that we heard today in the Cairo meeting?
I think it's a very important step because the international community always using the opposition as a pretext not to do any action, always repeating that the opposition is ununified, fragmented, etc., etc. This conference shows exactly the unity of the opposition against the Bashar Assad. There is no different views about Bashar Assad has to go, and the transition has to start without Bashar Assad. And the conference shows again and again that the unity among the opposition groups. Of course, there is different views, perspectives, how we can enforce Bashar Assad to step aside And I think this is why the discussion and the debate, which made the gaps between the different views much narrower.
Well, definitely they agree on one thing, that's for sure, that they want al-Assad out. But do you think that Syria or the Syrian government will take those decisions or those speeches seriously? Will they be considered?
I mean, the outcome of this conference is a message to the international community. As I said before, the international community is repeated every time that there is a fragmented opposition, there is no one address for the opposition. This conference will send a direct message, first to the international community that the opposition speak in one voice that Bashar Assad has to go. Then send a message to the Syrian people that there is no fear that after the fall of Bashar Assad there is a chaos or something like that. No, it's a message that the details of the transition will be very clear. Where any governmental transitional government will be in charge, and this will be responsible about the steps that we have taken until we have free and fair elections, which to elect a new parliament who's responsible on putting everything on detail.
Dr. Radwan, when do we expect reaction from the Syrian government?
I don't that the Syrian government will do any reactions on this conference. Usually they ignore. As now the Assad regime is a state of denial. They ignore what's going on in the country. They ignore all the condemnation, all the international positions, and they're repeating every time what's going on in Syria. It's about from international controversy. And I think this is why it shows that the Assad regime or the Assad himself a state of denial, and this is why we don't look for the Assad reactions, rather than we look how can we unify our agenda, how can we unify our efforts to enforce Bashar Assad to step aside.
So how can be any decision made at the Cairo conference implemented if there's no reaction from the Syrian government? How will all the steps be taken?
I mean, it's important now to send about having unified opposition, send the message to the international community, as I said before, then the international community stop using this as excuse, and we have the international community take two actions. First, to go to the Security Council to adopt a new resolution under Article 7. If the Security Council failed to adopt a new resolution, because the position of Russia and China, the international community, United States, and the Friends of Syria has to go through Friends of the Syria conference to build a coalition of the willing. Such coalition of the willing is only the venue to take action beyond the Security Council.
Dr. Radwan Ziadeh, Director of National Council of Syrian Foreign Relations from Cairo, thank you for being with us and for your valuable input. At least 10 victims died today in Damascus suburbs, 3 of them in Douma, which witnessed heavy attacks. Meanwhile, the regime forces continued shelling farms in Hamouria and the town of Beit Sawa for the 3rd consecutive day, and other towns and villages were also bombed with heavy artillery and mortar shells that resulted in the burning and destruction of several houses. The regime continued its shelling on many neighborhoods and towns in Damascus and its suburbs. More about Damascus we see in the following report.
A funeral comes after funeral. This is the routine that people in Syria have to go through to achieve their freedom that the regime is trying to take away from the Syrian cities. However, the people of Damascus and its suburbs, as all other rebellious cities, decided to revolt in order to oust the regime that increased its military campaigns drastically. Harasta, Madira and Masraba were constantly shelled by the regime that targeted many of its areas. The situation is also the same in the cities of Douma, Al-Damir and Hamouria, where the citizens are leaving the cities to find shelter in other areas due to the bombardment. And while the regime tries to invade the neighborhood of Nahar Aisha, the city of Daraya is undergoing heavy clashes. The continuous campaigns of the regime are being faced with citizens that are holding strikes and mass demonstrations, which comes in conjunction with the funerals that are being held in troubled cities, whose citizens stare into squares where thousands chant for freedom and the continuation of the revolution, no matter how long it took. The citizens in the old towns and the neighborhoods of Al-Maidan, Al-Qazaz, Zamalka, Qudsaya, Mleiha, and Mu'adhamiyat al-Sham also took to the streets in mass demonstrations that chanted for freedom and the downfall of the Assad's regime.
The local coordinating committees documented the death of 51 victims, mostly in Hama, where the regime forces committed a massacre today in Douma, which claimed the lives of at least 18 civilians. Meanwhile, videos showed the presence of the United Nations observers in Al-Atamina in Hama, despite the suspension of their mission. This new massacre that the regime's security forces committed in the village of Al-Dama and Hama included random gunfire shooting at residents and the burning of many shops in the village, which terrorized the residents who fled the village, fearful of another massacre to be committed by the regime forces. Halfaya city also witnessed similar violence by the regime forces, where many innocent civilians were brutally murdered, including 5 women. The city of Al-Qasir and Tel Killikh in Homs witnessed artillery shelling amid a cut of electricity and water. Also, the towns of Talbisa and Al-Ghanto were bombed by the mortars and heavy machine guns, and the agricultural crops in the Hula were burnt by the random shelling of the regime forces. Coming up after the break, clashes in Aleppo suburbs and citizens continue calling for freedom. Heavy shelling was also repeated for the 11th consecutive day on most of Deir ez-Zor, especially the eastern neighborhoods, and several shells fell on a house in one of the towns, while military aircraft targeted a school in another town in Deir ez-Zor. In the town of Naima in Dar'a, heavy shelling continued while many civilians were murdered and injured due to continued shelling. Furthermore, the regime's forces launched military operations of mass arrests amid the lack of food and medical supplies. The regime's forces also demolished more than 60% of the town houses and infrastructure in Dar'a. A big explosion shook the area of the central prison of Aleppo, which was followed by the disconnection of electricity in the city and heavy gunfire. This comes at a time where the regime continues targeting the towns and villages there by bombs and helicopters, causing the death of at least 3 civilians and injuring many others, in addition to the destruction of many houses.
على مدينة عزاز ريف حلب 2/7/2012.
Elsewhere in Aleppo, Zahra neighborhood witnessed in the morning clashes that took place near the branch of the air intelligence, according to activists. Meanwhile, shelling continued in the cities of Aleppo countryside, where several were killed and wounded.
Deadly clashes are occurring between the Syrian Freedom Army and the government forces in Aleppo suburbs, mostly in the city of Al-Atarib, where the regime forces retreated from the suburbs and then centralized its troops in the municipality building and turned it into a military camp. What also confirms the loss of the regime's grip on the ground is its use of military planes on many areas in the rebellious suburbs of Aleppo. In Azaz, many houses have been destroyed on the top of their owners, which led the Freedom Syrian Army and the citizens to try and save them. Meanwhile, the number of descendants, including officers and soldiers from the military, increased after they announced that they joined the Freedom Syrian Army and initiated military councils in several provinces. Al-Jina, Kafr Halab, and the city of Al-Bab were also shelled, leaving several victims dead and wounded. And activists broadcasted images showing civilians targeted in a bus, transferring them to the area of Afrin. The bus was targeted by a missile fired by the regime forces from the military airport of Minna. What is going on in Aleppo suburbs find echoes in the hearts of the rebels, where several civilians were killed and captured. And all the cities and towns of Aleppo, including Al-Kallasa, Al-Halak, Al-Hamdaniya, Al-Marji, Al-Ashrafiyya, the neighborhood of Al-Masharika, Salah ad-Din, Al-Sakhur, Al-Zahra, Al-A'damiyya, Al-Muyassar, and Al-Indarat, continue in the revolution, demanding their freedom and dignity.
Moreover, Idlib witnessed a heavy raid in the village of Jisr Najia Shagur, and heavy gunfire. Several other areas of the outskirts of Idlib also witnessed helicopter shelling, which rampaged the village of Al-Kinda and in Jisr Shagur. Meanwhile, areas in Kilis camp were shelled heartlessly on the Turkish border, which resulted in massive outbreaks of fires. The regime's army also executed military operations that swept away the farms surrounding the city of Idlib. Despite the escalation of the military operations in the rebellious cities, demonstrations swept today several Syrian cities and towns. In Idlib, cities and towns of Atamania, Hasfarkiya, Marshurin, along the Jisr Shughur, witnessed massive demonstrations denouncing the Syrian regime. In this Orient exclusive report, many questions are answered as to why the citizens of Syria would drop out of school and quit their jobs and join the fight against al-Assad.
If the regime's excuse in bombing its own citizens is that terrorist groups are residing in Syria, then the regime needs to reconsider its claims, because the only group fighting against it is the Syrian Freedom Army, whose members consist of nothing more than the Syrian citizens who dropped out of their work, schools and universities in order to join the fight against the regime's violations. The members of the Syrian Freedom Army said that they can just surrender their weaponry to the government and go back to living their lives normally. But they choose not to, because their future doesn't rely on neglecting what is going on in Syria. It relies on achieving a change in their country that will allow them to get the real education that they deserve and the jobs that will allow them to have a flourished future. Members told Orient News that for 40 years they have been getting a brainwashed, uncredited education, and that now is the time for a change in order to achieve what the Syrian population has been asking for a long time, which is to evolve and make a difference in the world. This is the story of why the Syrian Freedom Army continues to fight against the regime's machinery, risking their lives in order to achieve freedom and a better future for them and for the coming generations.
And before we end our bulletin, we remind you of the main stories. The Syrian Opposition Conference starts in Cairo today with 250 members from the Syrian opposition. Morsi declares his support for the Syrian revolution. Zibari announces his support is biased, and Uglo declares that his country is a haven for fugitives.
For political change in Syria is now shared unequivocally by the entire international community.
And at least 80 killed in Syria today, and the Syrian citizens continue to protest against the regime amid an increase in military campaigns. And with this, we end our news bulletin. From Orient TV, you can join us tomorrow at the same time for the latest updates on the Syrian revolution.